Can everyone hear me okay? Awesome. Humans are indeed no more than animals, and any narrative which says anything to the contrary is merely a way by which we justify all the terrible and problematic practices of humankind to ourselves. Three things in this speech. Firstly, on the counterfactual, secondly, on colonialism, and lastly, on more general immoral actions. Firstly, on the counterfactual and what the narrative looks like. This narrative existed in many forms throughout history, right? Like if you look at ancient Greek philosophy, like Chinese philosophy, and like later European philosophy, they were all based off this starting premise, and trickling down from like the wealthier, more like aristocratic classes to everyone else. It's a widely held belief in lots of places. Really, what it kind of has emerged is simultaneously with large civilizations, like large buildings, like large banks. You have money, and we think we must be different from the donkeys who don't have money is kind of the way that the thing emerged. What is the counterfactual to this? We say it's quite simple. We understand that humans are no more than just parts of nature. We may have built buildings, but beavers build dams. We are simply are just different by degrees, but not different by kind. That is to say, we are more understanding that we are merely animals with all their faults, and we don't think there's anything particularly special about our position above and beyond the other animals. Okay, firstly on colonialism, and this is going to land a significant impact in this debate, which I think would be hard to get over. Obviously, there are heaps of structural reasons and an infinite amount of narratives that go into colonialism. But our claim is merely that the absence of this narrative would have made colonialism a lot less, the excess is a lot less violent and in general a lot less expansive. So how was this narrative used and weaponized to subject Indigenous people to tremendous treatment? Absolutely tremendous amounts of harm. Firstly, it was clear that when people arrived from colonies and they have this narrative from Europe that what makes us human is the banks and philosophy and writing, they assumed the people that they were coming into contact with were in fact not human beings because they don't have this essential component. Rather, like due to the dichotomy, they must have been animals and part of nature. Therefore, like this was a fundamental part of what colonialism was seeing people who were unhuman and assuming that humans have some sort of right over them. How did this actually affect colonialism? The first thing to say is this makes treatment of the local people. Sorry, give me a second. The first thing to say is this makes the treatment of the people there so much more gratuitous than it otherwise could have been, right? The colonists used the narrative, what they were doing, to justify it to themselves, to justify it to the people back home, any onlookers, right? People have this voice in their head that what they're doing must not be right, but they can tell themselves this is right because we are the humans and we're conquering the animals. Secondly, I think in a world with, and like the example of this, if you look at the treatment of the French when they arrived in England, which was essentially a colonial project, that was far less vicious, far less violent, far less dehumanizing than when the Europeans arrived in other places. And the one reason was all these structural incentives were there on either side, but the one narrative they couldn't push on the English was they must also be humans, given they fell into the conception that the Europeans and the French at the time put onto them. The second thing this does is when colonists arrive, they are more likely to build amicable relationships. I'll take a point from closing.
Probably the best thing that humankind can do for nature is just to go extinct. Should humankind go extinct?
Yeah, like maybe. I actually have no idea. Like, I think that, we are obviously still self-interested like the other animals. So whatever else. Okay, so more interested in building a relationship with the people when they arrive there. Why is this? Because our views would more align with the indigenous people, like that the Europeans arrived at. Because in the counterfactual, we would have similar views about our role in nature and see the way that they enact it in their life as a part of nature and think that's not different to us. That's just a different way that they interact with nature. And I think they're also more likely to share an understanding of the human position in general. The third reason is you can't push the teleological argument around you and your friends in both the self-justification, but also the justification to your population back home who hear about the atrocities. Because when this narrative exists, you can say, don't worry, we're ensuring they become human or they take on the features that it means to be human. Like I prefaced this argument at the start, we don't think colonialism didn't happen, but the worst excesses, the worst violence, the absolute slaughter and genocide of millions of people certainly would not have happened. Secondly, the more broad immorality that this narrative justifies. Now, I think there's probably an argument opposition will try and make, which is, we think we're moral, which makes us act morally, which is like, something that progressed us and means that we're quite good people in retrospect. Why this is not the case? This is for two main reasons. Firstly, this narrative will always be weaponized by those with the most power, like almost any narrative to exist. So all that happens is we reproduce the social inequalities. We assume whatever situation we must be living in now, given it's what makes us human, must be moral, and therefore we reproduce. And secondly, because it's a self-fulfilling cycle. If you read any of these philosophers, the thing that they start with is that we are humans, so we are moral. Therefore, anything that we do must be moral because that's what humans do. That's how they justified things like the patriarchal and strict like biological sex differences, because they assumed this is what humans are. We are moral. Therefore, the continuation of these kinds of things is entirely moral. Other things like slavery was justified in similar ways. Once again, like the colonization argument, all of these, trends, whether it's patriarchy or slavery, were driven by a bunch of incentives and a bunch of historical and material narratives at the time. But what precisely does this narrative do? And what this team argues and what we want to argue is that humans are deeply empathetic and capable of understanding our wrongs. People were crying out against slavery hundreds and thousands of years before it ended. People were crying out against the patriarchy in hundreds and thousands of years before it ended. What happens when you have this narrative? One, you have a cognitive defense against your own guilt and empathy. You say things to yourself like, well, this is what it means to be human and we're moral creatures. So we may as well keep doing it and I must be wrong, because changing it in any way would be subjecting ourselves to some more animalistic tendency. Two, the social dialogue gets shut down and smothered because people can push this narrative on one another and once again appeal to, the divine humanity that we have as a justification for any institutions and practices that we have. And thirdly, the immoral can justify their actions to others. Like with, the example of colonialism, almost all examples, those who are truly and deeply immoral will always try and weaponize this narrative in order to say why what they did was right or why what they did was wrong. We think in order to get over either of these claims, the opposition has to tell us why this narrative did nothing, why in all of these situations I explained that had no effect at all. Because even marginal improvements on how colonialism went or how patriarchy went is just such great benefit to such a large group of historically vulnerable people. We think we win the debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd like to invite the leader of the opposition to begin their case.
Hi everyone. Could I please check if I'm audible? So I'm just gonna rearrange a couple of papers. Abstract motions and narrative motions might seem hard to conceptualize and a bit abstract. But in reality, there exist many points in human history where the lines between man and beast were blurred. It was precisely in the examples of opening government when individuals viewed other human beings as nothing more than beasts, and therefore it is justified to subjugate them in those instances when man becomes beast truly. Two arguments, therefore, in this speech. Firstly, does this make us treat each other better, directly clashing with opening government? Secondly, is this true, weighing out against any nature argument in the rest of this round? Firstly, is this good in terms of how it affects the way we treat each other? I have three reasons why this makes us better morally. The first is that it just means that we hold ourselves to higher standards than animals. Empirically speaking, animals treat each other terribly, right? They literally physically murder each other all the time. Stronger animals dominate weaker animals, and it's literally a hierarchical conception of how nature is like. The strong dominate the weak in nature. Rape is normal, and it is genuinely something that lots of animals do. Murdering other animals is perfectly morally justified, and we never ever say anything about how, for example, it is morally wrong for a lion to kill another animal for food or for sport, as many, for example, dolphins, cheetahs do, just to train their young to hunt or just for the sake of keeping their skills up. In all of these cases, animals physically behave in terrible ways to each other. What does this mean? In the counterfactual, like, these guys just get it wrong. Philosophers don't say we are human and therefore we are moral. It is we are human and therefore we ought to be moral, right? It is that we hold ourselves to a significantly higher standard. We tell ourselves that even though animals behave in this way, the precise thing that gives our lives value is that we don't. We derive value from being moral beings and from being able to recognize this morality in other creatures which are similar to us. Therefore, this allows us to create morality as a whole. Now, there are two possible ways you can read this. First is that it means that if you don't buy this argument fully, the minimal impact of this argument is that it makes us resist naturalistic arguments in economics, philosophy, politics that say the strong will always dominate the weak, that then make it the truth, and the truth that people buy into and subscribe into, that millions of people lived under for hundreds of years. Really, we make people more resistant to that and move away from that slowly. Maximally, if you truly buy this argument, government bench lives in a state of war of all against all, because that is the state of nature. That is the state of a humanity that does not recognize that the only thing making us different is our conception of morality and our ability to reason and be logical and reasonable with each other and live together well. Secondly, human beings empirically display much more of a difference to animals as compared to each other. And I will just call out opening government for just being deeply wrong. It is not the case that colonizers went to different colonial settlements and found no philosophy, no thought. There were philosophers, there were thinkers. They behaved much more differently to each other than to animals, right? They behave much more similar to each other as compared to animals. They just overlooked them. Clearly then, in all of these cases, it just was not the case that they saw this difference between themselves and other as a justification for colonialism. Why did they do colonialism? Because colonialism started under monarchies like Spain and Portugal, which just are not accountable to the masses and their moral philosophers. The kings of Spain just did colonialism because they wanted money, and other states had to catch up, right? So empirically, that just was not how colonialism was impacted. But how did this narrative impact colonialism? Later on, after the British Revolution, empirically, the masses and demanded the same rights be afforded for these other colonial peripheries because they were displaying education, they were advocating, they were displaying philosophy. Think about all of the post-colonial philosophers which literally formed the foundations of our nation states, like Lee Kuan Yew and Anwar Ibrahim, right? These were the individuals who went to the colonial core and demanded rights based on the common humanity and based on the philosophical language that these guys outline as the core thing that causes colonialism. So this narrative doesn't cause colonialism, it allows us to push back against it significantly and hasten the end of colonialism as a whole. Thirdly, the faith in a common humanity allows us to behave well. And this is the empirical section of it. Not only do we believe that we ought to behave well, we believe that other people are different from animals. And this narrative allows us to treat them better. We have faith in them. We don't believe that they will backstab us at the earliest opportunity. We believe that they have the capacity for reasoning, thought, love, care, all of these things which then allow us to treat them better. Empirically, what does this look like? Number one, we are more willing to sign peace treaties with them, to live in harmony with them, not oppress them, invade them, harm them preemptively, just in case they harm us back. But we are also more likely to do things like invest in them, provide poverty aid and alleviation to these people, because we believe that eventually this will grow the economy. You don't do this to dogs, cats, or bears. You do it to poor individuals that you believe genuinely have the human potential to flourish because they are just as good as you, just as valuable as you, just in different circumstances. A belief in a common humanity as a moral aim as well as an empirical observation helps us build this forward and make this a reality. What are the impacts of this? Number one, as our government identifies, even if we don't get our maximum impact of war of all against all, minimally, we cause colonialism to end faster. We cause reforms to happen more. We have marginally more help for the poor. These are all massive wins that compound throughout human history, because that is apparently the range of this debate. Second question then on whether this is true. This is my second argument. Before that, I'll take anything from closing. All right.
Sorry. You say this improves our morals because we elevate ourselves above the lion hunting the gazelle. But there is no distinction between this and humans killing and hunting all sorts of animals that we eat on the daily.
Oh, perfect. My second argument. Is this true? I will do a robust philosophical defense of the difference between humans and animals for three reasons. Number one, I'm sure that GovBench, I don't know how OG didn't do it, maybe CG will explain that animals are different from us and are the same as us and they can feel pain. But sentience has an equal claim to being the only valuable thing in the universe as pain. Think about it. If you create a collection of pain cells in a petri dish and shock it, it is morally ambiguous whether you're doing a right or wrong thing. But if you create a sentient creature and hurt it, you are definitely doing a wrong thing. This implies that the most certain morality is based on sentience, not pain. Human beings are genuinely unique. We uniquely experience sentience. We have identities, memories, loved ones, connections, things that animals just cannot have, or we're not certain whether they have, because when we observe similarities in patterns of behavior, it is guesswork because we can never epistemically access what it's like to be another animal versus another person who has the same brain structure as you, has the same ability to express as you, and is with whom you can actually establish close connections. Secondly, sentience allows us to experience particular forms of suffering that animals cannot. The knowledge that we are being hurt, a perception of future hurt, and catastrophizing about it, anxiety, identity, All of these are ways by which we can uniquely suffer that animals can't, that genuinely puts us above them in the pecking order. But lastly, it is just more intuitive to us. And I know that in debating, we like to think of morality as something that's objective. But think about it. If I ask you, why is pain bad for an animal or a person, you cannot give me a logical answer. And the reason for that is that all of morality is to a certain extent determined by instinct, determined by what you feel in your heart. And the truth is, we just love and care about human beings empirically more than we love and care about animals. This is the morality that we can unlock far more when we try and cultivate that and emphasize that we build identity of that, but it also is genuinely the basis of morality as a whole, which then means that it is correct that we prioritize humans over animals.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd like to invite the DPM to continue the debate.
Oh, I'm just confirming I can be heard. I would absolutely say that the world would be a better place if the human civilization as it was currently disappeared and everyone died. We ruined the world and we cause an immense amount of suffering to every single other creature on the planet. And that doesn't require you to believe that every human as a moral obligation ought immediately kill themselves. The claim is simply that we could be a force for good on the world if but for this narrative, in a world where you are actually willing to consider the needs of other creatures. So I'm going to start by talking about animals and nature. Our claim from the premise is that murder in general is abhorrent, and clearly as a panel you would agree that murder of a human is abhorrent, as is death, torture, imprisonment, etc. And we would suggest that animals are in fact equal and ought to be considered equal to humans for a few reasons. First of all, opening opposition is wrong that animals don't experience logic, sadness, anxiety, fear. These are all things that we have already observed that animals experience. They often are actually found to be sentient, and we have increasing evidence that they are sentient. But crucially, the claim that, well, we're uncertain, so you ought not care about it, just clearly would not hold up if you're doing a moral calculus. So even if you are uncertain if animals were sentient and experienced the same degree of pain and suffering or joy as humans could, that would not be a reason not to care about them, but you should still care about them. So for example, if someone was in a coma and we didn't know if they were capable of experiencing pain, you wouldn't do a bunch of torturous experiments on them. You would clearly weigh that almost as highly as if they were alive, because the risk that you are torturing billions and trillions of entities over the course of history is such an important claim. Why is it that with the absence of this narrative, people are more likely to, not murder and torture and kill animals, and why is that so important? The simple reason is that people do have capacity to feel guilt and empathy and a moral obligation towards animals, even when they're under pressure. So for example, if I was hungry and my friend had food, I wouldn't kill them, even if I wanted to get the food. And we suggest that similar would be true for animals. Even if people experience some need to, for instance, feed themselves, it's unclear why that would push them to kill what they now accept is an entity of at least relatively comparable moral value to themselves. Whereas in the counterfactual, the reason that humans can justify to themselves that they should hunt animals for sport is, well, I'm different, I'm special, and I need not consider the suffering that I'm causing this creature. And we would just claim as well that most humans throughout history weren't at the point of need that you actually need to kill an animal. Like, maybe, yes, it's true that if a human was truly starving, it would be fine to kill an animal. But our claim is that for most of history, humans weren't starving. Like, we're not carnivores. We can eat plants. And for much of history, it was easier to eat plants because you could just forage, and because since civilization, it's far more efficient to just, grow crops. In fact, in the modern day, it is so much more efficient to grow crops because otherwise you're going to use up water in the process of killing a bunch of animals. And so we would just suggest that even if this doesn't stop the killing and torturing of animals throughout history, it significantly shifts the needle. People in cultures where human sacrifice is disallowed probably don't sacrifice animals, which saves a massive amount of lives. People don't kill creatures for sport, but people don't kill creatures for inconvenience. People stop randomly stepping on bugs that are out there that could be experiencing excruciating pain as a result when they're left writhing on the floor for literally no reason, which is a behavior that people often do. So not only can we save lives and consider them more, but we also likely incidentally engage in a bunch of policies which are good for the climate in the long run and good for the planet. So for example, if humans like 100 years ago were more empathetic to animals and didn't farm massive amounts of cattle, we'd probably have less of an issue with climate change. We'd probably be more willing to do things like oppose deforestation, which drains our ability to take carbon out of the atmosphere, all of which is incidentally good for humans, but massively good for animals and mammals. animals. The final observation I want to make is that it is just probably the case that these animals are equally important. Like birds sing, they make art, they appreciate beauty, and they like exist in relationships, like committed monogamous relationships. Like I would suggest that they do experience a lot of the same meaning. But even if that's not true, pain is still important. I would care about the pain cells in a petri dish. That explains why it is just the case that the massive amount of harm that is caused, far more than any humans, it stems from this. The next thing I'm going to do is give a defense on our argument on colonialism. And I think that a lot of the analysis that comes out of LO is just unresponsive. Their counterclaim, though, is that, well, you granted rights based on the common humanity. But the problem is that opening opposition needs to defend a world in which humanity has an additional criterion, as opposed to where humanity has one less criterion. So it's the fact where you need additional things to be human, like Ali explains, that you don't recognize their humanity, whereas, like, they're human. Like, what? Like, how would you justify that they're not human without the existence of this norm? That's insane. Then they say, well, in general, you're more likely to trust others. We would explain, one, the capacity of humans to reason that exists on this narrative is the reason you don't trust others, because you shouldn't. They will backstab you if it's better for them, and that's not a thing that's likely to exist. But second of all, like, people trust animals. They would require you to believe that no one ever has a dog in case it bites them. Clearly, this is not true. The next thing I want to do is explain generally, though, why people are still likely to be more moral. We explain that it's this narrative that provides a convenient explanation of why people aren't immoral, which means they're okay with doing pretty evil things. Everything that you do is likely to be okay. And crucially, this narrative is never used to attack bad behaviors. And that's because people who control these narratives don't ever themselves want to be at risk of a breach. So, for example, if you're like a priest in an older society that controls these kind of narratives and whether or not people are seen as doing evil things and still seen as being human, you don't want to accuse someone of not being human because they do something evil, because you probably also do evil things. You yourself want to be entitled to this impermanent humanity, and we'll suggest that it's when morality is no longer seen as inherent that people are more likely to actually seek out and judge others' moralities, because that's just something that you do. Before I move on, closing.
What is it like to be a bat?
I don't know, but it might be pretty terrible because humans are awful. The next thing I'm going to do is just respond to their arguments on why you don't treat humans better. They say, well, you hold humans to higher standards than animals, but this doesn't lead to a good standard. So just because we don't behave like animals doesn't mean we behave better than animals. Most animals don't go to war. It's the fact that we think that human society ought to have a structure and ought, like concentrate resources and take over others if you can push your society forward, that leads to war, which I would suggest is worse than the peaceful coexistence that many animals have. And like, sorry, not all animals kill each other all the time. They live in symbiotic relationships with each other. They have community. Many animals have been proven to look after the young of parents the young who are not their own, purely out of empathy for other animals, which is a behavior humans did not do for a lot of history. Then they say, well, this supports naturalistic arguments. But again, they don't explain why naturalistic isn't inherently bad, whereas these kind of norms like the strong should be prioritized over the weak happen for other reasons. It's so we can order society that gets stronger. The final thing I'm going to explain is why people are just happier under our side. In the counterfactual, when people think that humans are special, people feel like they need to be special. You cannot just be a part of the world, you have to be above it. And that is why people are not happy existing, tending for their local area and their community, tending for the planet around them. And we would suggest it is empirically true that the cultures that didn't adopt this narrative, like Buddhism, often are happier because it doesn't force people to believe they're exceptional. We would suggest it is good if people want to look after the rest of the world around them, and that will bring them happiness.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd now like to invite the DLO to conclude the top half.
Just give me a moment.
I'll close the window.
Okay. Okay, sorry. If the project of human exceptionalism isn't perfect, it's because we fight against our animalistic tendencies every step of the way. We did have colonialism, and today we have sovereign equality. We did hunt for game, but today we have reserves. And once upon a time, we did have slavery, but today we have the right of every human being to life, dignity, and to flourishing. That is the success of human exceptionalism. It has not always been perfect, but as morality evolved, as people got more of a voice, and if people will confer rights that we otherwise did not have, we have greater conversations and discussions that merge us towards a more universal, more sentient sense of morality that I think all of us in this room are able to perceive. The first thing I'm going to do is to take out the Gov counterfactual, because Gov's arguments about whether or not this is a good or bad thing per se fall short absent of them proving a comparative. And here's the likely comparative, because we accept that our system has flaws, but we think the ours would be far worse. Absent human exceptionalism, you probably had two options. The first is that you would replicate nature in the way that you see it. And this was likely to be the most likely one because of the simple reason that OG provides, where they say we are basically animals and nothing more. That means three things. The first is that we biologically evolved to be selfish and greedy because resources were scarce. We only were kind to people insofar as they were useful to us. That's why for the vast majority of human society, we were tribalistic in nature, and it would be your tribe against other tribe. The second one is that resources were scarce generally, which means there would necessarily be conflict between people. This is where opening government tries to provide an alternative comparative that they just assert when they say, but you'd see one another as co-equal. That doesn't explain why you'd see them as more important, i.e. worthy of negotiation. Insofar as they were co-equal, you could do whatever you wanted to them, and when it wasn't convenient, you could necessarily step on them if that necessarily furthered your own aims. The third reason is that simply there were visible markers of differences between people, and without a unifying narrative of human exceptionalism, it's all too easy to isolate people who are different from you to justify your nefarious goals. We were different in language, culture, and appearance. This is a unique narrative that cuts across race. Nature is hierarchical, and therefore we would still do things like kill animals because we needed to eat them. We'd still do things like kill them because we wanted to make coats or because they kept us warm, which means all of their arguments about the harms we impose on nature were likely to be symmetric, and I don't know why we'd be in a state of perfect harmony. We just didn't evolutionary evolve to be that way. What I'm then going to do is to then do three things. I'm going to explain why this forms the foundation of human society, therefore negating the worst case outcomes, and I'll flag out my responses to white exceptionalism as I go. This is the foundation of human society. It was narratives of human exceptionalism that dictated that we ought have moral and legal systems that ought not be right the same way it is in the animal kingdom, because insofar as we were different, we ought be better, and different meant distinguishing ourselves because animals are the lowest common denominator. That's why over time we have distinctions. We have things like human rights, we have justice, we have an attempt at international laws. These aren't just recent things with the formation of the UN. Historical laws about respecting like the formation of treaties or about not taking women and children prisoners are things that have always stood and were our nascent attempts to evolve human exceptionalism. Without this, there's absolutely no reason to value our lives like below the lives of other creatures, i.e. we don't necessarily form relations with those individuals. The reason why human exceptionalism was so powerful is because it's the only thing that ever counted what otherwise would have been a continuous mark on human history, right? Genocide, slavery, racial discrimination. That is what happens when might equals right. Now, this team wants to flip that because they go, well, actually, we did kind of do these things, and these things were bad, right? Because, we promoted things like white exceptionalism. The response here I'd like to note is that this is likely symmetric, because while the French said they invaded Vietnam for God, gold, and glory, you just take the God out. Gold and glory is still an animalistic reason to invade a society. You didn't need the excuse of civilization to necessarily overtake them. They had superior technology, they had the guns, they would have done it anyways because it was a competition for resources, and they believed that they necessarily needed that, which means that people in power uniquely didn't need this narrative to necessarily justify their conquest, which means that this serves exclusively as a countermeasure and a voice to people who otherwise didn't have it, which allowed them to rise up in the mass waves against colonialism that we saw in the 1940s and the 1960s. The second reason why this is an exclusive benefit is because it otherwise provides an opening that did not exist. Sure, the powerful could monopolize this narrative, but just for how long could they do so? We put an idea into human society that if you were a person, you had value, and that is what allowed us to overcome the reins of our animalism to begin with. We think that's a benefit. Now, I know this is a retrospective debate, so they might go, but for the vast majority of human civilization, we were rather bad, right? But I think this is significantly better that we have a shameful past than a perpetual future, because on our side of the house, this would have lasted into infinity or lasted significantly longer. Colonialism was terrible, but it is thankfully a 200-year regrettable blip on human history as opposed to our indefinite future. We think those harms are something that we therefore necessarily, that those benefits are something we ought value. Before I move on to the wing on how it's shaped human flourishing, is there any points from closing? Opening.
Ants live in complicated communities, whereas stick insects do not. Human society and governance pre-existed this norm, and surely it would continue to exist after it.
Yeah, human society and governance and like our tribal systems, we didn't necessarily care about other people. We go to war just for the sake of it. Again, we go to war for like gold and glory as opposed to anything else. There's no reason why we would necessarily behave better precisely for the reasons your speakers give. Here's how we have the flourishing of human society, and this one I'm going to explain why we are uniquely the team that is able to benefit nature. Note, at the start of human society, it was mankind's desire for exceptionalism that allowed us to control nature. We had fire, agriculture, industrialization, medicine. This was our desire to manipulate and control the natural environment to our whims to facilitate us, because we believe we ought not be subservient to nature in all of its comings. In the more modern age, we had things like science, we had vaccines, climate engineering, and this was done because we believe that anything is possible and nature ought to have power over us. Previously, people would have lived until 35, child mortality was sky high, people died for all sorts of terrible reasons. Human exceptionalism is the reason why we had the arrogance to concoct science and the arrogance to decide that we were going to live longer. We were not going to let nature kill us the way it killed all other animals. And as Ian explains, today we have the welfare state, international aid, development projects, because we believe all people are inherently worthy of human flourishing, and that's why we ought uplift those. That's why we consider the birth lottery immoral as opposed to a justifiable allocation of resources. But uniquely, we're the only team that therefore necessarily helps the environment. That we care about the planet stems from our ability to reason morally beyond mere instinct. We put convenience below exceptionalism because it's our sense of duty. We can also argue that we ought care about nature and animals because we care about people and we care about things like the cultural value and interest we derive from preserving species of animals because we want to see our children do them. We care about the climate not going to shit because we think about the people who might live in places like Tuvalu or Vanuatu that are necessarily going underwater. We would have no reason to care about those people if not for the fact that we believed every single person was exceptional. Panel, at the end of this day, you ought believe. We had no reason to see value in one another intrinsically. We would have prescribed it in a utilitarian manner, and that would be a society to regret.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd now like to welcome the member of government to continue the debate.
Sorry, Mia's just filling up her water bottle. We'll be with you in 1 second.
My Mother, the Land is probably the most famous Indigenous poem about Aboriginal people's relationship with the land on which they live. My mother, the land in which I live, the land that is with me. This is the sort of relationship that individuals who are Aboriginal and Indigenous people have to the land they live on. This is the explanation as to why you can justify colonialism, because Indigenous people themselves perceive themselves to be at one with the land that they live on. They cater to it, they treat it like a sister, they treat it like a brother. So you don't need to believe the analysis that is half-cooked, undebate, and I would argue just dissonant from the way that Indigenous people perceive themselves at opening government. We will give a far more comprehensive account as to why this led to colonial violence. But we'll do a couple of other things in this speech. We're going to talk about the environment. It hasn't come up yet in the debate. Pretty fucking shocking. And finally, we're going to talk about empathy. Firstly, we are going to mechanize the opening government claim that this became a colonial violence. Opening opposition says, well, people did colonialism because they wanted money. Sure. They also wanted land. Those two are two different accounts of why people came onto the land. That is not an opening opposition win in this debate. Opening government explains that we did colonialism because we assumed that Indigenous people weren't human. This is also true to an extent, but certainly not the most compelling account of the rationale of reasons why colonialists were able to come in and kill people en masse. Both of these claims are flawed. We are going to resolve them. Why then does exceptionalism provide a rationale for colonialism? Indigenous people themselves identify within nature. They consider themselves an extension of country. And that's not contingent on white people thinking of them as barbaric. It is their own interpretations of their existence, the land. That is the way that they live on the land and they develop with it. That is the way that in Dreamtime stories, they are embedded within the culture. They are drawn as one in with the land, wherein you cannot differentiate between where a human ends and the land begins. Thirdly, it looks like looking after the land like you would your family. The reason why we do backburning during fire season in Australia, because we look after the land like it would be our cousin or our brother or our sister, because that is the Aboriginal philosophy that we have been taught by the First Nations people. Importantly, this is just a significantly better explanation than the one comes from opening government, who assumes that exceptionalism is based on racial ideologies of colonialists. We explain that the way Indigenous peoples perceive themselves is the reason why these narratives could be corrupted and co-opted by white supremacists to be able to do things like take over native lands. That is the way that this argument functions within the debate. The problem here is that English settlers were able to do things like claim terra nullius, not because they viewed Indigenous people as barbaric because they were racist, but because Indigenous peoples viewed themselves within the land. And when you arrive at land that ostensibly nobody is on, because it is all natural matter, that is the way in which you can justify the mass oppression of individuals. That is the mechanism that activates the claim on opening government. Panel, if you care about mass impacts of colonialisation, if you care about the slaughtering of so many First Nations people here in Australia and abroad, this is a claim you have to credit to closing government. Please check the mechanisms. Secondly, and importantly then, I'm going to explain the environment. Opening opposition explains that this narrative exists in the context of animals. That is maybe true, certainly though it exists in the context of the environment, and I think this is a far more likely and easier to mechanize claim. We will take on a lower burden here. Firstly, people view humans as superior to the environment, but importantly, in direct opposition to the environment. So even though we don't think we are necessarily better than a tree, certainly the survival of a tree comes at the expense of the survival of a human being. Opening opposition says, but we do care about the environment. We want to protect it. Maybe that is true, but this explains that it is fundamentally incompatible with the way that we perceive ourselves as human beings because of exceptionalism, which is why we override this preference to caring about natural matter because it is incompatible with our own interests. And this is for a few reasons. Firstly, a forest existing near an urban centre is a reason why a housing commission could not exist in that area. That is why a lot of the parks we have had to be man-made and re-brought into the land, because our initial care is about having somewhere for individuals to live, and a tree living there comes at the expense of a family being able to have their house there. Panel, maybe you think that is simple, but it's certainly the reason why it's led to mass degradation of forests all around the world. But secondly, having clean air that is nice to smell in comes at the expense of having an economy that manufactures things on scale. People do care about things like clean air, but it's obviously in direct contrast to a more pressing interest of making money. Exceptionalism is what caters into people's interest of finance and caters into people's interest of massive development. That is why this preference is always logically prior to ones that support the environment. Opening government says, well, the narrative is immersed that we are the individual. This narrative emerged at the point of industrialization. That is the framing they offer in this debate. That is true, but importantly, they never realized the impact of that claim is you get things like climate change. What do these impacts look like? Firstly, you have fewer landscapes, you have fewer green spaces, fewer trees, fewer pieces of grass in the ground. Two, you do things like bomb natural resources. You do things like mine. People like to have valleys and oceans, but they care more about having resources because exceptionalism tells them it is okay to mine things to death. Three, you get mass deforestation. That is why the Amazon is 1/3 of the size that it used to be. Four, you get overfishing, people taking out more animals. If you care about OO's claim on animals, this is the most likely manifestation of the policy. Fifthly, it means you get things like coral bleaching. That is why going to the Great Barrier Reef is so fucking ugly. We did like the Great Barrier Reef, but it came at the expense of the capitalist interest of developing quickly. That is why it looks the way that it does now. The impact of this is, firstly, our environment degrades to a point at which it impacts us. However, the impact of us in the long term is secondary to the proximate impact of us right now, which is why it is overweight in the debate. Secondly, places just become a lot uglier. I'll take a point from closing. Opening.
So humans are omnivores like dogs and bears. None of them give a toss about the environment and will happily destroy it if it gave them another meal. The human exceptionalism holds us to a higher standard. Many vegetarians say we are stewards of the environment because we are better than them.
Yeah, I'm going to deal with your claim on holding people to a higher standard when I do the extension on empathy. Importantly, though, your claim earlier that's like we have science now and development was worth it is just obviously untrue, because we explained that the amount of degradation this caused was necessarily gratuitous. It did not need to increase to be able to have a level of development that would have been sufficient for survival. Thirdly, on empathy then, OG identifies that people have empathy. However, they don't explain why this narrative allows people to override that preference. Opening opposition says, well, we learn to not be like animals. People rape, people murder, people do all of the things they claim all of the fucking time. But also, no, I'm not even going to say that. The most powerful reason that the narrative gets overridden is because people are now have an easy rationale to outweigh their interest of empathy, because they can do things like say this narrative tells them that they are superior. It means you spend less time critically thinking about the perspectives of other people because you initially deem them as inferior to your own. You believe as a human being living in a majority group in a majority country in the world, your opinions are valid and the most important ones in society. That is the reason why you dismiss others. That is the reason why even where empathy exists, it does not manifest in the way that opposition bench claims. So proud to govern.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd now like to invite the member of opposition to present their case.
Opening opposition say that this narrative allows us to hold ourselves to higher standards, and in its absence, we would treat other humans as the equivalent of animals. Government says that actually we do the opposite and we drag up animals and nature to the status of humans. So this just depends on like what is the more likely counterfactual narrative, and that is what we are going to comprehensively prove in closing opposition. What is the counterfactual? The first prong of this extension is that the counterfactual just comprehensively cannot be that nature has equal moral worth to humans. There are a couple, and this just beats, I think, GovBench very comprehensively and is probably the strongest contribution to the op bench. Why is this the case? Firstly, is because obviously we have no access to the perspectives and the views of nature of animals, and therefore it is extraordinarily difficult to extend any empathy towards them. I asked Sam, what is it like to be a bat? In the words of Thomas Nagel, no one fucking knows. But moreover than that, what is it like to be a patch of grass or a rock? Think about it. People probably would not empathize with those things because they cannot complain, they cannot share their hopes and their dreams. But secondly, because human narratives arise throughout history in response to material necessities. And so it is extraordinarily implausible that we would ever adopt a narrative that is at our own material expense. Opening government preempt this when they say we don't need to eat animals. 4 responses to this. Firstly, obviously we need to subjugate animals and use them as tools before machinery. 2, lots of regions in the world are dependent on animals. Some of them aren't like a cornucopias of agriculture, especially like people that moved around a lot, like nomadic tribes and stuff, right? Thirdly, animals gave us the necessary nutrients that we could not have survived for the vast majority of human history without. Things like iron and protein, which maybe in like the woke 21st century we can do like with other stuff, but it's very, very difficult back in 0 BC or whatnot, right? But fourthly, because for the rest of nature, we need to use those things as resources. We need fucking fuel. We need to chop down trees to build our houses. We need to build ships and whatnot and cars. We need to do all of these things and we need to justify it to ourselves. And so it's very implausible that the narrative would be, actually you're doing a serious moral crime every single time you do any of those materially required things. The thing is that narratives need their own self-reinforcing support, otherwise they cannot be enduring. If it is the case that this is so opposed to our material interests, this is not the likely counterfactual. What is the counterfactual? It is likely to be not human exceptionalism, but sectarian exceptionalism. That is to say that you say not all humans are worthy of moral status, but it is only people from your ethnic group, only people from your religion. It is God's chosen people. And I'm going to explain, I know this sounds very derivative. If you listen very carefully, you'll understand why it is not. So why is it the case that this is going to be the comparative? And I think that, Dillon gestures towards this, but we're going to give some mechanisms. The first is that your people's moral horizons are necessarily limited in nature. That is to say that we only empathize with the people whose perspectives we understand the most, can identify with, and interact with, because it's only when you have conversations and interactions every single day, negotiations, that you actually understand people's logical capacities, that you come to feel some sort of empathy towards them. But secondly, you want to be able to prove that your immediate community, your family, the people who care for you and you care about, have more protected moral status, because you want to make sure that they are protected within that society and other people respect them as well. Which is why you need to come up with reasons why you are special and why you are different from other people. And so in the absence of like logic and stuff or moral capacity, you are likely to latch onto morally arbitrary factors like skin color. We want to feel superior to others in some way, and we need to like justify that to ourselves, and so find factors of differentiation. Okay. Now, how does this interact with a bunch of other teams? On closing government, they say that Indigenous beliefs about the land is a counterexample of this. The first thing I would suggest is that this is like obviously one example. It's not structural analysis. Secondly, I think this works in very specific instances. So like it probably only is plausible in areas of extremely low population density where you can have such a harmonious relationship with nature, which I think is not true in the vast majority of the world. And so I just think that for most of human history, various societies would not have had this as a dominant narrative. What does opening opposition say? The brunt of their case is basically, well, other people are now different from you, and so now you can discriminate against them because they're different, and there's no check, right? There's no like voice in the back of your head that says, well, these are people and they have moral status. And so basically the argument is you have pre-existing material pernicious incentives, and you need this narrative as a countervailing force. We make a stronger claim, which is that we actually prove we prove that with both horns of the dilemma, which is that what is it? Oh yeah, if our fundamental capacity for morality and reason can no longer be the key factor that determines worth, and we cannot elevate the rest of nature up to the moral status of humanity, we need then to raise skin color or religion as the fundamental determinant of moral worth, which provides a strong additional reason to subjugate others. But I'm going to provide other reasons why we beat opening opposition. Okay, I'm going to weigh in on the stuff about colonialism from opening gov. The logic that they provide is the wrong way around. They say that premise one, people believe that what makes us human is X, like logic or whatnot. Premise two, we don't think that other people have X. Therefore, they are not human. If you read the info slide, the logic goes the other way around, which is premise one, all human beings have X. Premise two, you meet other people and they are humans, therefore they have X, right? So if you read the info slide, you ought to believe that if you think that they are humans at all, which is a factual scientific question, you believe that they have moral value. Like obviously colonizers knew that these people were human. Sometimes they said they weren't, but that was obviously cynical and like a lie, right? Like this is a fact of science that eventually over time, even if initially you got it wrong, can be discovered. On their side, sectarian exceptionalism can accept that other groups are human, but that they are still worth less than you, which is an incredibly, comparatively more difficult belief, and it's a stronger rooted belief to change, rather than the purely factual question of are these people human or not? And that's the crucial way in the opening opposition doesn't provide, and I think it's pretty useful. OG.
I might not know what it's like to be a bat, but I can see animals cry or care for their young or sing. Maybe I need to eat meat sometimes, but why do we not save the lives of trillions of animals that were killed literally for no reason, like a cockroach in the house?
Firstly, I dare you to empathize with a cockroach, right? Like, or even if you, Samuel Juice, the incredibly empathetic and nice person that you are, but the vast majority of human history, people are kind of shit. They have material interests. They think about themselves and their families first. When you're hungry, when you are cold, you do not extend empathy to other people, especially if they cannot speak or they look incredibly different from you. You only think about yourself and your immediate interests. Why does this lead to a significantly better treatment of others? The important point here is that, so the question is, who buys into this narrative, and who of that subset are the people that actually make the most impact? We think this narrative uniquely influences the most powerful people in society. If Alessandro was right, that this is a philosophical position that is explored by Aristotle, by Plato, by other peoples like that, who are the people that read Aristotle? Who got access to a philosophical grammar education for the vast majority of history? It was Frederick the Great. It was like princes and leaders and Prussian leaders who were the ones calling the shots. And if you believe that they have a bunch of other bad incentives, the very least thing that you can do is spend 18 years of their youth telling them that other people are of equal moral worth than you, which is the most direct way of actually having a practical impact in this debate. For those reasons, I'm proud to oppose.
Thank you very much. And to finish up the prop bench, I would like to call on the government whip.
Hi, just confirming that I'm audible. Great, thanks. I'm going to start by recapping our extension and weighing it against opening government. I want to make two notes about how closing government is able to neatly solve a lot of the problems in opening government's case. The first is that there is a tension in opening government's case. That's because they first of all say that morality is inherent, and they give a bunch of reasons for that at Prime Minister. But then they explain a series of things that people have done all the time that is terrible. And the problem with that is not an inherent tension, but it is one that needs to be resolved on this government bench, because there's a question of degree, right? Why does this norm override the empathy that opening government themselves explains people are capable of and have inherent to them? That's the gap that closing government is able to fill. And it's also important because it's how opening opposition is able to attack opening government's case by explaining, well, no, people have empathy, so this norm is not the reason why people were able to do that stuff. It's out of convenience. That's how we solve the opening half clash. Because, first of all, we mechanize the colonization argument to its fullest. And I'll deal with the kind of pitiful response that we get to from closing opposition. But if you actually have a look at the mechanizations that opening government provides, they don't do the base layer of analysis, which was, why was this the norm that enabled people to pursue colonization in the first place? But second of all, we answer the question of why is it that this norm overrides people's empathy? And I want to spend a little bit of time kind of rationalizing exactly why that is. First of all, it's because the most powerful instances where this narrative is the one that people pay attention to is where people don't have an immediate understanding with the people that they're interacting with. It's because the info slide says things that it's like because of our moral and logical capabilities. So if you don't understand or don't think if you don't understand someone, it's because you think they don't have the same capability as you. So when you're in those instances where you lack an understanding or a kind of a mutual, a mutual common ground, instead of seeking to understand and instead of seeking to rationalize, you can default to this narrative, which allows you to opt out of the process of empathizing with people. But secondly, it's because the people who are most in power are able to weaponize this. And opening government asserts that and then goes, so that's really bad. But the problem is they don't actually explain why it is that the people in power are most able to weaponize this. The reason that closing government quite neatly explains is just that power is a symbol of success and a symbol of superiority. So the people who are in power can go, we are the most exceptional and we are the most superior. And the effect of that is that they're able to remove a lot of the checks and balances that otherwise would have existed on their decision making, which is how you end up with things like monarchs rather than kind of councils of people who make decisions. And it's that reason that unlocks all of the rebuttal that opening government gives when they explain that the people in power are able to abuse this. But third of all, and perhaps most crucially, it's because it stokes the most intense experiences of selfishness, because human psychology, with or without this norm, likes when people tell us that we are good and when we are validated. So when we say, well, you have the ability to bulldoze the environment or hurt animals because you are superior, that is a norm that feeds into our subconscious biases that we have in our little human brains in a way that disables some of the other empathy mechanisms that otherwise kind of would be firing up in other parts of that brain. Those all explain why this norm is able to override a lot of the inherent empathy that opening opposition uses to attack opening government's case. That is the first reason why we weigh above the opening government bench, opening government. But second of all, we introduce a totally new area of the debate, which is the environment. And this weighs above them in two reasons. First of all, it's because opening government's claim is, well, if we like animals, we will try to help the environment. But there's a key crucial premise that's missing, which is just that what closing government provides, which is why is it that we have been so unbelievably unable to help the environment, even where it might have made sense for us? And it's what Mia gives you in the government member speech, which is that we view, because of human exceptionalism, we view ourselves as distinct and in opposition from the environment. So every single move that a human makes is in opposition to what the environment does. And every single time we have a benefit for the environment, it comes with a human cost. Every single time we aren't able to extract resources, that is humans who couldn't make profit or couldn't develop their society. And every single time we do, it's something that comes at the cost of the environment. We need to have a radical, not to get like really philosophical, we need to have like a radical shift in the way that humanity comprehends the existence of the environment in order to be able to start solving some of those problems. And closing government is able to be the one who fills that premise and explains why is it this narrative holds us back from doing that. But second of all, this is just the biggest impact into the long term. Opening opposition says, well, we've only had a short human history so far and we're going to have much more to go. If we nuke climate change and nuke the planet to the point where we die out and we take all the animals that opening government explains we should be sympathetic to with us, that is a harm that captures opening government's analysis about why animals are important and deserve empathy and shouldn't feel pain, and explains a much more tangible and severe and concrete and certain irreversible harm than what opening government is able to do. Before I move on to responses, I'll take that POI from opening.
Reader points out that colonialism, environmental destruction, etc., primarily originate from selfishness, greed, and violence. Doesn't building humanity or human identity around not being animalistic and cruel nudge society towards being better, and even if we don't do it perfectly?
So the problem is, like, both sides spend a lot of time making out why people still have empathy in their everyday lives, right? Which means that ordinarily selfishness and greed, and I'll actually get onto responses to this now for you, but the first note I'll make is that selfishness and greed would ordinarily be outweighed by the empathy that we have for each other. So it's only when you activate this narrative, which closing government explains is able to override the empathy that people have, that you start to get those harms. I will actually deal with this claim now, though, which is you rise. OO says, well, this narrative spurs us to rise above the morality of animals. I want to make 3 responses. First of all, they try to prove that we don't do what animals do, which is the crucial premise you need to believe in order to believe that this narrative spurs us to rise above animals. But they just don't. We POI this to them when we say, well, you say the lion shouldn't hunt the gazelle, but we hunt the pigs and the cows and everything else. And their response is, well, let me prove why it's okay to do wrong to animals. That is an admission and a concession on their part. This norm actually does not challenge us to outdo the moral frameworks of animals. So that is the death knell in their case, in their own POI response. But second of all, this is not the reason why we develop morality. We do it because firstly, it's selfishly good. If I agree not to murder my neighbor and my neighbor reciprocally agrees not to murder me, that's kind of a win-win for both of us. So in a selfish way, we're able to activate a lot of that empathy. But third of all, but also because it's just overall more productive for society. But crucially, morality requires an inherent level of brain capacity and logical thinking, which humans and many animals do possess. So it's likely that it happens to some degree. It's about, first of all, who we apply that empathy to. Do we extend it to animals and do we extend it to the environment? And closing government is the team that's able to get you to do that. But secondly, whether this norm limits our empathy, and our extension explains why that is not true. Finally, I want to rebut closing opposition. I'll first deal with the claim they make, which is that the counterfactual cannot be animals and the environment at the same standard as humans, because if I disprove this premise, the rest of their extension is out. This is an incredibly stupid burden to place on the government bench, and it is one that we do not have to meet. Because in the same way that people recognize that, like, might hold ourselves to the same standard, sometimes we still recognize that hurting other people is inevitable. Like, if I need to do something and I'm in an awkward situation, I'm going to hurt one of them, even if I agree that I'm on the same moral level as them. So it's not that we need to elevate the environment and animals to the same standard as humans, but we need to stop the gratuitous violence of animals, which yes, includes eating meat. And we also need to protect the environment, which, as I've already explained in this speech, is the most important thing. The sectarian counterfactual has no mechanization for it. They just do a lot of impacting for why it's bad. That should not win them the debate.
Thank you very much for that speech. And finally, to finish up the debate, I'd like to call on the opposition whip.
Sorry, BRB. Can I be heard? Good? Okay. Panel, the movement to abolish slavery in Spain was fronted by Montaigne and other, importantly, Christian philosophers and thinkers who pointed out at the government and the Spanish Inquisition and said that this is morally wrong because people, and even these people, are equal to us. Bad actors can justify things on both sides. We cannot comprehend the brain chemistry and psychoanalyze these bad actors on what their motivations are. But we explain that when these bad people do bad things, we are able to fight back in the only way possible, that is through the parameters of their own society. Because it was through Christians that slavery was abolished. It was through Christians that colonialism was targeted. And that was the only way in which change was able to occur, regardless of this debate about what do colonialists think? Oh, they like this, but they actually want to act moral, but they're immoral. No, bullshit. We're the only side that explains that. First an extension, then an OO, then CG, then OG. On our extension, Aidan was very clear here. The counterfactual, and he explains very clearly, was racial or sectarian exceptionalism. He explains this and it's dealt with quite uncharitably. But the reason for which is very simple. Humanity always wants to and needs to feel superior to something else because everything in nature is a trade-off. If someone has a home, another person doesn't. If an animal lives, a human dies. If someone is hungry, then someone isn't fed. Everything in nature is a trade-off, and we have to deal with those trade-offs every single day, which explains to you why humanity always wants to justify those trade-offs. They always want to say that it was worthwhile colonizing someone, it was worthwhile doing something else, because it benefited our own people. And that's why this narrative was really important, because it meant that the comparative in this debate was not just like, it was whatever, but it was racial exceptionalism, because people now felt the need to feel superior to other races, because they were the only ones that could comprehend morality or could comprehend logic. Therefore, people will always, and bad actors will always act in bad ways, but this narrative is the only way to counteract that. We didn't need to solve the psychoanalysis of bad actors to win this debate. Then onto OO and why we outweigh it. They have kind of two main claims. Firstly, is on why you have better morality under their side. You hold people to a higher standard, and then you increase morality over yourself than animals. And also, colonialism was started due to power-hungry monarchs, and colonialism wouldn't start in their side because people would demand rights. But the two issues with this: firstly, they don't prove the counterfactual. They need to first prove the counterfactual to show that you are able to show that comparative was that colonialism would operate in this way. But secondly, it's a bit uncharitable because bad actors and colonists obviously didn't just be like, wouldn't just on the comparative be like, well, now it's immoral, so I shouldn't do it. No, they'll still try to find justifications as to why they should do it, which explains to you why our extension kicks in and explains to you why now we're able to hold these people to accountable throughout history. The third claim, and this is how we're able to co-opt all of their benefits on why you treat people better and why you're more respectful and empathetic towards each other. We come logically prior. The final claim they make is that this is a true narrative and therefore it's a correct and one we should follow. I think it's a principle. This is so unimportant. We believe things even if they are untrue all the time. Like, I don't believe that free will is real, but like I still act and believe and live my life as if free will exists. We don't have to be fully in tune with our philosophical beliefs to live. So this is why this claim is just it just holds no water in this debate. Now onto the meat of the debate, which is about CG and OG. Firstly, on CG, they have three main claims. Firstly, that this would lead to colonialism because white supremacists were able to claim land, and they were able to justify it by being like by weaponizing indigenous rhetoric against them. But like, just sense check this. Did like the colonists did Captain Cook go to Australia and went around polling indigenous people like, how do you see nature? What is the ideology that you prescribe to weaponize that? Obviously not. They were just racist. They did just want to kill them at the benefit of their own people. They just wanted a colony to claim as their own, which explains to you why our extension proves why we don't need to prove that the mentality of these colonialists or how the decision-making process actuated in the first place. We just need to prove that we were able to hold them further accountable. Secondly, they explain why people view themselves as a greater priority than trees. And they explain why this is why you have housing over forests. This is why you do things like mining places. And notice how the impact shoots themselves in this foot, because the impact is that these things affect us. But given that they affect us, surely that also plays into our narrative, which is like we should do things like, if a place is really ugly, then obviously that also harms us, which explains why our narrative would also shield us against those impacts. Because we would be like, humans are like the most important creatures, and so we should have the most amounts of beauty in our lives, and that's why we should have a forest. So I think this is oddly symmetrical. But secondly, oftentimes this is good. Some of these trade-offs are just good. And also it's probably good if someone doesn't feel guilty for having housing. It's probably good if someone doesn't feel guilty and told that they're immoral people for eating meat out of necessity because it's the only food that they can get. And that's the narrative that the Gov Bench has to defend, a narrative in which people feel disenfranchised because they have to feel guilty about the ways in which they have to live, because they have a home and they feel guilty for that fact because it comes at the cost of nature. No, they should feel like they deserve that home. Thirdly, is that they have an argument about empathy. They explain that people have an easy rationale to override empathy. The issue with this is that they already had the mechanisms to override that empathy, because colonists already had the intuition to override their empathy through utilitarian benefits or whatever. This is the only way to counteract that. I'll take a POI quickly.
Under human exceptionalism, the only life worth living is one which imposes often wayward moral expectations and rationalized structures on others. Why are people not happier caring for the world around them on our side? Because you don't need to be so complicated.
I think people just like submitting to a world that has a like a sovereign, right? Like, I don't think people are just like they want to live in a world where they can choose their own adventure and do things. I think people are often quite happier when they're able to just live a life where morality is kind of not an issue. But let's do the weighing against CG here, because op bench is like you don't think they're human and so you enslave them, and our claim is that you believe that they are human, but you still think they're worth less. Why is our version much more important if both pay off? Because whether or not you're human or not is a factual question, whereas this narrative is far harder to change because it's not about whether you're human or not, it's about whether your race is more important than another race, and that is subjective, which means it's harder to counteract, which feeds into our extension, because our extension explains how even if colonists existed, the fact that you are human is a literal objectifiable thing, which explains to you why you're able to then counter those narratives. This weighing beats OG in a way that OO is unable to do. Finally, on OG then, they explain a number of things. Firstly, they have a counterfactual, but this is clearly not the counterfactual. We explain what the counterfactual is. They explain the narrative will be propagated by those that have the most power. This kills them. If the narrative is propagated by those that have the most power, this is the same under the counterfactual. This means that colonists are able to propagate their narrative in the way they see best fit. They're able to propagate white superiority over everything. They next claim that like this colonialism. They said that violent treatment because of this narrative. Our extension flips this argument. Blah blah blah. I just want to say this because it's funny. I think they say that people are happier and that Buddhists are the happiest people in the world because they don't live under this policy. The Buddhist like number one thing that you learn in Buddhism is dukkha, which is translated into life is suffering. I don't think these people are the happiest or love life the most because the Buddhism literally tells you that life is suffering, that living in this way is suffering, and you should bleach beyond that life. And that's why I'm very proud to post.
Thank you very much for that speech. And again, thank you to all the speakers.